In this lecture video, we'll be looking at Louis Althusser's theory of the ideological state apparatus in his book on the reproduction of capitalism, ideology, and ideological state apparatuses. Two primary questions that lead Althusser to develop his theory is first, a very basic one. How does capitalism reproduce itself? What makes it possible such that the social forms of reproduction persist? And the second question is, what is the capitalist state? What is the state that exists under capitalism, and its relation then to the way in which capitalism reproduces itself? A basic Marxist understanding of the relationship between the state and capitalism can be summed up in terms of the idea of the base and superstructure, that every society is comprised of a base and a superstructure, wherein it is the base which determines the whole edifice ultimately, or in the last instance. The base is understood to be the unit of the productive forces and the relations of production. So think of capitalist activities that we might think of in terms of worker and boss and really commodity production, but as well as the relations between persons in a position to labor, all of those kinds of things, capital, money, all of that is the base. The superstructure then is the political, legal, religious, and cultural institutions that rest upon and are determined by the economic base. So, of course, the basic or traditional, maybe we could say like a Marxist understanding of politics, for example, is that, the problem with liberals and so on is they focus all on the politics, on the state, and they don't really pay attention to the base of society, what determines society, what society rests upon, which is the economic and social system of reproduction. And so this idea of base and superstructure is supposed to show the ways in which then all those political, legal, religious, and cultural institutions are actually affected by the base. So by merely writing theories about how the base ought to be constructed, or the nature of, how the superstructure, how political institutions, for example, ought to be constructed, without taking into account their relation to the economic base, means that you cannot develop a full theory of the political, for example. The law, I think, is a very good example of a situation in which, or an institution in which we can easily identify the law as being something pertaining to the superstructure, something which seems to exist to regulate, right, the economic system of reproduction, and which explicitly, I think, is repressive. So we can understand, Althusser says, the law to be a system of codified rules which are applied in day-to-day practice. So it's a system of codified rules which then we can see regulating social and economic behavior. Now, of course, again, going back to the base and superstructure relation, we would see that, it does so for the sake of the base. The base then determines, right, the formal structure of the law. And it is the formalism of the law which makes sense only to the extent that it is applied to defined contents that are necessarily absent from the law itself, such that, of course, the law being a formal structure, being a system of rules, can't account for the particularities of that exist in society. This is just a basic understanding of the nature of law, which is why interpretation, in the case of judges and courts, at least to a certain extent, is necessary. So Althusser says that law has the form of law, which means it has a certain formal systematicity, but it does so only on the condition that the relations of production, right, capitalism in a sense, the relation of production as a function on which it exists, of which the law exists on the basis of the reproduction of capitalism, is completely absent from law itself. Now, that does not mean that the law does not influence, or there aren't laws about, labor rights, or there aren't laws about corporate espionage, or there aren't laws about certain ways in which you can produce things, or dump raw materials, or whatever, right? All those things that pertain to kind of economic production and reproduction. But what the law does not do is it does not question the foundation of the economic system itself. And it does not do so because the law exists on the basis of the economic system of reproduction. Now, to this extent, then, the way that we actually experience the formal systematicity of law is through repression. So for Althusser, law is necessarily repressive, but this kind of repression is regulated by legal and moral ideology. So you don't have just like mere repression that exists in the case of the law itself, right? But you have a certain kind of legal and moral ideology which says what is the extent, what is the purpose of the law, such that it regulates then the way in which repression is permissible. So he says, the vast majority of legal persons observe the terms of the contracts that they sign, and they do indeed do so without the intervention of, and even without preventative threats from, the specialized repressive state apparatus. They do so because they are steeped in the decency of legal ideology, which inscribes itself in their behavior of respect for law and, in the proper sense, enables law to function. Enables, that is, legal practice to go all by itself without the help of repression or threats. So, of course, it's not the case, most of the time that when someone signs a contract, they have to be forced to sign the contract and forced to obey the contract, right? Most people willingly sign the contract, and they see contracts as a good thing, and they see, not even necessarily a good thing, they take it for granted that there's such things as contracts, and you abide by them, and they help regulate certain aspects of society, right? Well, two questions maybe, right? Well, what then is the role of the law in that case, and then where's the repression? Well, repression is only there in the last instance, right? When people don't then obey the law. But most of the time, what gets people then to obey contracts, for example, and not break the law, is the fact that they have internalized a certain kind of legal and moral ideology pertaining to contracts, for example. So we can see just in the case of law, the fact that most of the time the law doesn't need to be repressive. Why? Because of the role of ideology. And this role of ideology, we're going to see, plays a crucial role in the operation of the state and its relation to the capitalist system of social reproduction. Now, in Marxism, there's not simply a theory of the state, there's a revolutionary theory of the state, such that you want to know, well, okay, how is it that we can overcome the domination exploitation of the capitalist system? What role then does the state serve in maintaining capitalism? And then how can the state be used to overcome it? Now the basic, or I don't even want to say basic, the crude kind of Marxist theory of the state is known as economism, which basically says the state is a mere instrument of domination and repression in the service of the dominant class's conscious will. But Althusser is going to ask kind of a basic question, but also a critical question. Okay, let's say the state is, right, this mere instrument of domination and repression. How is it that the state apparatus can persist? Well, in the case of law, we know it doesn't persist by incessant and constant repression. When we look at the state, we also see that, okay, yes, most people perceive the state as a function of state power, that they see that, well, what maintains the existence of the state is its monopoly on violence. But the reproduction of the state itself is beyond state power. It's reproduction, how it actually continues to exist and change over time, is not due to repression. Repression only occurs in the last instance, just like with the case of the law. So the state, or what we recognize as the state, what we can identify with the executive branch especially, and prisons, and police, this is just the repressive apparatus of the state. And what this tells us in terms of Marxist revolutionary theory of the state is that merely seizing the state does not enable universal emancipation from capitalist domination and exploitation. As Althusser says, the effect produced by the superstructure is simultaneously to ensure the conditions under which this exploitation is carried out, where it's not recognized necessarily as exploitation through what he calls the repressive state apparatus, and that the reproduction of the relations of production, that is, of exploitation then, are carried out through the ideological state apparatuses. So this leads to Althusser saying, no, the simply repressive theory of the state, that especially we find in anarchism, for example, that is an incorrect understanding of the state. The state is actually two parts. One part repressive, other part ideological. Althusser defines the ideological state apparatus as an ideological state apparatus is a system of defined institutions, organizations, and the corresponding practices that are realized in the institutions, organizations, and practices of this system, being all or part, generally speaking, a typical combination of certain elements of the state ideology. The ideology realized in an ideological state apparatus ensures its systemic unity on the basis of a kind of anchoring in material functions specific to each ideological state apparatus. And these functions, then, are not reducible to that ideology, but they serve it as a support. So, on the one hand, we have the state existing in the form of repressive apparatuses. Repressive apparatuses, they function thanks to violence. They are the things that we most commonly identify as, when we say what is the state. The state is the police, the state is prisons, the state is courts, the state is the executive branch, the governor, whatever, right? These kinds of explicit institutions, I'll say. But the state doesn't exist on repression alone. It mainly exists due to ideology and its ideological apparatuses. So we can see then the different kinds of institutions that are part of the repressive state apparatus. That being government, administration, army, police, courts, and prisons. Ideological state apparatuses, however, are scholastic apparatuses such as academia, university, familial apparatuses, religious apparatuses, churches, political apparatuses such as political parties, as well as other kinds of non-profit but nonetheless political organizations, associative apparatuses, information and news apparatuses such as, of course, corporate media, CNN, Fox News, as well as all kinds of social media. The social media companies themselves, Facebook, TikTok, publishing and distribution apparatuses, and the cultural apparatus. And this is going to be the thing that, Althusser is going to say, look, these culture wars that are so often the focus in politics about, abortion or gay marriage, or, drug legalization, the sanctity of the family, whatever, those kinds of things, right? Althusser is going to say it's not that, abortion isn't important. It's not that, whether drugs should be legalized or criminalized is not important. But it's that these are kind of like surface level issues, right? They don't get to the core of society, which is the system of economic and social reproduction. And the reason why we don't talk about those things in political discourse is because political discourse revolves around issues in the ideological state apparatuses. They obfuscate the economic base of society. So there's a double functioning then of the state apparatuses. All state apparatuses function simultaneously on repression and ideology. The repressive state apparatus functions overwhelmingly on repression while functioning secondarily on ideology. So this does not mean that ideology is absent in repressive state apparatuses, but that they're just secondary. So he says, I think I can claim that all state apparatuses, repressive and ideological alike, function simultaneously on repression and on ideology, but with one very important distinction that precludes confusing the repressive apparatus with the ideological state apparatuses. The repressive state apparatus, for its part, functions in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on repression, at the limit, direct physical repression, while functioning secondarily on ideology. So here's an example. The army and police, for instance. Internally, they train their own recruits both by repression and ideological inculcation. But externally, they act by violent repression, but also by discussion and persuasion. The latter watchwords of discussion and persuasion appear black and white in the circulars issued by police chiefs and army generals possessed of a modicum of good sense. In May 1968, for example, Mr. Grimaud, the Paris police chief, conducted discussions in person with the Wild Ones during the battles in the Place Maubert. The army and police also operate with the help of their own ideological aura. For example, the slogans, join the army and learn a trade, and the prestige of their uniforms. Join the riot police and you'll stand guard over the beaches, and so on. Now, the ideological state apparatus then functions overwhelmingly on ideology, but repression still is a secondary function as well. So he says, similarly we may say, but the other way around, that the ideological state apparatuses for their part function in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on ideology, while functioning secondarily on repression, even if it is, at the limit, but only at the limit, quite attenuated and more or less symbolic. Let us give a few examples of this secondary repressive functioning of apparatuses that function in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on ideology. The school and the church, to take only those two examples, train not just their officiants, such as teachers and priests, but also their wards, the school children, the faithful, and so on, with the appropriate methods of punishment, once exclusively and often still physical, and also, of course, moral. Although I think corporal punishment doesn't exist anymore in schools, although maybe still homeschooling, right? So he says expulsion, selection, and so on. These are also forms of repression. News and information, publishing, and entertainment carry out with, or much more subtly, without the backing of the law, daily censorship, which is unremitting and extremely vigilant, since this censorship lodges itself in advance in the heads of authors who take the precaution of censoring themselves in the name, of course, of their professional conscience and decency, or the proper behavior that one owes the fatherland, the dead, and families, leaving aside virtue, which has lost a bit of its lust these days, since intellectual freedom has to be lodged somewhere, for instance, in two-bit eroticism. So he continues on. I won't read the rest of these examples, though. So he gives 4 theses concerning ideology. Firstly, ideology represents individuals' imaginary relation to their real material conditions of existence. In this way, then, we can understand ideology to be both an illusion, such that it is not really what is happening, not really the basis of one's existence, but also an illusion, right? An illusion to what we most want our existence to be, for, maybe an unconscious desire to not come to grips with reality. So the wrong interpretation is that what is reflected in the imaginary representation of the world found in an ideology is people's conditions of existence, hence it is their real world, right? Marxism is famously a critique of idealism. To this extent, then, what is represented in ideology is those individuals' imaginary relation to the real relations in which they live. So we cannot simply ask people how they feel or what they think in order to determine, how they actually feel or how they actually think or how their circumstances are. To some extent, a Marxist would look at certain kinds of polls that, ask people, how do you feel about the economy or whatever else, right? And it's not that those polls are uninformative, but you need real material analysis if you want to know how are people actually doing. What they say their condition is of secondary importance. Secondly, ideology has a material existence. It's not simply, some idea that immaterially exists. So the wrong understanding of ideology would be to say that it exists in ideas, or it is idea dependent, or even that it has some kind of a spiritual existence. Rather, ideology always exists in an apparatus such that it is always in relation to institutions and in the practice or practices of that apparatus. So there is no ideology that we investigate beyond the practices and institutions in which we inhabit. There's nothing that's just in our heads, divorced from the rest of social existence. Thirdly, there is no ideology except by the subject and for subjects. All ideology exists for the sake of individuals and their relations among themselves. All ideology, then, it hails or interpolates, meaning it internalizes concrete individuals as concrete subjects through the functioning of the category of the subject. So he gives an example. So he says, we shall go on to suggest that ideology acts or it functions in such a way as to recruit subjects among individuals. It recruits them all, or it transforms individuals into subjects of some institution or practice. It transforms them all through the very precise operation that we can call interpolation or hailing. It can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace, everyday hailing by, or not by, the police. Hey, you there. If to offer readers the most concrete sort of concreteness, we suppose that the theoretical scene we are imagining happens in the street. The hailed individual turns around. With this simple 180-degree physical conversion, he becomes a subject of the repressive apparatus of, the police, the practices of the police. Just by simply saying, hey, you there, right? The subject recognizes me in relation to the authority, the police, turning around. Why? Because he has recognized that the hail really was addressed to him, and that it really was he who was hailed. It was not someone else. Experience shows that the practical telecommunications of hailing are such that hailing hardly ever misses its mark. Verbal call or whistle, the one hailed always recognizes that he really was the one hailed. This is a strange phenomenon, after all, one that cannot be explained by guilt feelings alone, despite the large numbers of people with something on their consciences, right? So this would be someone saying, no, it's not that they recognize, their position, they're subject to the authority, but it is that they, maybe thought that they did something bad, and so they think, oh no, I'm in trouble, I need to turn around, right? It's not that. That's a kind of secondary rationalization of the phenomenon occurring of the interpolation, of the internalization of concrete subjectivity. Or is it that everyone always has something on his conscience, and that everyone confusedly feels, at least, that he always has accounts to render or obligations to respect, if only the obligation to respond to every hailing? Strange. Naturally, for the convenience and clarity of exposition of our little theoretical theater, we have had to present things in the form of a sequence with a before and an after, that is, in the form of a temporal succession, whereas there's someone walking, someone, of course, says, hey, you there, and then the person turns around, right? So there are individuals walking along, somewhere usually behind them. The hail rings out, hey, you there. An individual, 9 times out of 10, it is the one who is meant, turns around, believing, suspecting, knowing that he's the one, recognizing, in other words, that he really is the person the interpolation is aimed at. In reality, however, things happen without succession, right? The subject was already a subject, which is why they turned around to the hail. The existence of ideology and the hailing of interpolation of individuals as subjects are one and the same thing. We may add that what thus seems to happen outside ideology, to be very precise, in the street, really happens in ideology. And that is why those who are in ideology, you and I, believe that they are by definition outside ideology. So this is actually the fourth thesis. There is no outside ideology. We always believe it is others who are ideological. We can always identify certain ideological beliefs, certain ideological practices. But the most difficult thing is to recognize our own ideological beliefs and practices. As Althusser says, ideology never says, I am ideological. One has to be outside ideology to know that one is ideological, to be able to say, I am in ideology, or I was in ideology. And yet, that would be impossible, since it is by ideology that we recognize other kinds of practices. We are able to identify other, perhaps, subjects and analyze them accordingly. What about an objection? How can it be said that institutions like religious apparatuses, political apparatuses, cultural apparatuses, and so on are part of the state apparatuses and therefore public? Because it would seem like, look, now you're just trying to confuse the public domain with these more private domains of existence. And Althusser replies by saying, all the private institutions we have mentioned, whether owned by this or that individual or the state, function willy-nilly as component parts of determinate ideological state apparatuses under the state ideology in the service of the state's politics, which is the politics of the dominant class. In this case, the capitalist class. So just a couple examples of ideology. The first one, in the top left. I think this is perhaps most easily identifiable as an instance of ideology, right? Where you have football games, you have the big flag, you have the flyover, the planes, and you do a Pledge of Allegiance and salute the military and all these kinds of things. I mean, I think it's most obviously an instance of ideology, especially for the fact that the Pentagon actually pays the NFL to do these things. Then we've got the case in the top right, this Rise and Grind book, right? How is this ideological? Well, clearly this kind of rise and grind mentality always work no matter what, always be thinking about how you can continue to maximize your ability to make money or to profit. That kind of helps churn, of course, the capitalist social and economic systems of reproduction. We've got the case in the bottom left, when it's Pride Month and all the different corporations put out there, we support Pride, blah, blah, blah. right? Like, what's really going on there? Well, they support pride. They're kind of signifying this kind of moral or social virtuousness. What function, right? And that's what we always need to ask. What is the function? What does it serve? Well, of course, to say, oh, I like this company. This is a good company. I'm going to keep buying from them. So the company does it because ultimately it's going to make them more profit. And what about in the case of the bottom part of the screen, this family, right? How is this ideological? How is the family ideological? Well, the notion of, and this is, I think from the 50s or 60s, right? You have the kind of breadwinner, the mom stays home, she takes care of the kids, the kind of gender roles. These kinds of things are also ideological insofar as they serve to maintain a certain social system of reproduction that benefits capitalism. Now, then you have later on the breakdown of that, which turns to what? The sexual revolution. The rejection of this kind of what was recognized as an ideological account of the family. What did that sexual revolution, and now having families, have two breadwinners in the family? What did that, what ultimate ends did that serve? Well, the ends of capitalism. More workers. Not just the male, not just the husband, both, right? To work in and to labor for the production of commodities, to make more profit. There are always ways in which you can find then, according to Althusser's analysis, various forms of the ideological state apparatus and how it helps to regulate and preserve, ultimately, the reproduction of the economic base of society, the reproduction of capitalism.